So today we're going to talk about engine assembly. This will be a multi-day lesson. We'll start off with just the kind of basic stuff of reassembling the engine. And this is a continuation of, we've already done the lesson on all the engine components and how they work. We went over how to measure and inspect parts. And the final part of this is to how to assemble the engine and learn some of the techniques that we'll be using to assemble the engines. So, introduction of parts and ordering. Now that we have the engine all apart, we've cleaned it, we've inspected it, we've determined what parts need to be replaced. Now we have to get some parts coming our way so that we can get these, get the parts on in, and we can finish putting the engine together. Engines, once the engine has been measured and cleaned, you're ready to order parts and assemble it and make a list of the needed parts for rebuilding. You're going to be replacing all the gaskets, seals, and O-rings. So when you look for those parts, you know you got to replace them all. When ordering parts, you need the engine identification numbers from the starter shroud or the data plate, depending on where they are. If we look at this picture on the top right here, we'll see this is the data plate that Briggs & Stratton uses. They stamp this right into the engine shroud right here. Makes it kind of easy. On a Honda, they're cast down here and they're stamped right into the engine down here. And you can kind of see an example here of what they look like. The parts dealer will use these numbers to locate the correct parts for your engine. Without these numbers, you cannot get the parts for the engine. Sometimes these numbers wear off. Some people switch the covers around, and this kind of messes up things when it goes to order parts. Also on overhead valve engines, these numbers are going to be stamped on the valve cover on a Briggs & Stratton. So different manufacturers put them in different places. Just got to look for them. You got to have them all when you go to order parts. All those numbers are needed. Now Briggs & Stratton uses 3 groups of numbers that they need for ordering. If you look at this example right over here, 126L02, this is the model number. So this gives us the model number of the engine. The next group of numbers, 1015-F1, this is the type number. I'll kind of explain what all this means in just a minute. The last group of numbers, 1003-1858, this is the code number. So if we take each one of those, the model number explains how many cubic inches the engine has, what kind of starter is installed, and other important information for ordering parts. So for example, this is going to be either a 5-digit number or a 6-digit number. If it's 5 digits, which they really haven't made in a long time, but if it is, the first number is going to be the cubic inch displacement. So if you see right here, those are the cubic inch displacements. But typically it's going to be 6 digits, so it's going to be the first 2 numbers. But look at my example right here, 42, right there is the cubic inch displacement. That's a 42 cubic inch engine. Then you could start seeing other information, really not so important to us, but crankshaft. Over here you see crankshaft position, carburetor that's installed on here, if it has a PTO or power takeoff, gear reductions, the type of starters, information that it's important for the engine, but not really for looking up parts. The whole model number is important, but not so much breaking this thing down and understanding what all those numbers mean. That's not super important. Brings me to my first question of the day. What engine number is 123K02 in the picture? So if I make that picture bigger, 123K02, that first group of numbers, what does it mean? But is that the type? Is that the code? Or is that the model? Moving on. The engine type number shows variations that are installed in the crank or on the engine. An example would be an engine that has the same model number may have a different crankshaft installed So it'll have a new type number assigned to that. So if I look over here using this example, 692571 would be a spring for a governor, except if your type number was listed under these alternate part numbers right here. So if your type number, let's go down to here, the last one down here. If your type number was 0114, you would use part number 693710. If your part number or type number was 0115 or 0117, 0118, you would use this part number 693206. If your type number was not listed under here, then this is what they call the primary part number, 692571. I gotta say, since the computer started, this has made this way easier. You just pick the right type number and you'll get the right coat. You get the right spring in this case, you get the right part. When they used to have books and microfiche, this was pretty confusing then. So this would be just variations. Sometimes they'll have different crankshafts that are installed in the engine. The model number is exactly the same. The engine is exactly the same. The only difference is they put a different crankshaft in there, so the type number would change. Model number would be the same, type number would be the same. Type number would change. Once again, looking at this picture over here, what engine number is 0195E1 in the picture? So 019, oh, that's a 3, E1. What does that mean? Is that the model, code, or type? Model, code, or type? Now the last number, the code number is basically a date code that shows when the engine was made and by what plant. So if we look at that, we break this thing down. The first two numbers is going to be the year the engine was made. In this case, the engine was made in 2001. Then we have the second group of numbers, 06. This tells us the month. In this case, the month was June. And then the next two numbers, 1, 2, tells us the day. The day. So this engine was made on June 12th, 2001. And the last group of numbers, 01, is the assembly line and manufacturing plant. And so this allows Briggs & Stratton, in this case, Briggs & Stratton, to really focus on if there's warranty issues, they could tell you the day, the month, the year, and what assembly line and plant just by looking at these numbers. And if there's an issue coming, they could figure it out and possibly find a solution. Maybe the rod caps were coming loose, the connecting rods were coming loose. And then they investigate and they find this time frame where all this is happening, and they can go right to there and find maybe that worker wasn't doing his job properly. The supervisor can get involved and fix these problems. Or maybe a torque wrench that was used on the assembly line was not calibrated properly. They could fix those problems. Next question. What year was this engine made in? What year? We're looking at this numbers. What year was that engine made in? 2007, 2005, or 2018? And within the Nearpod, you can always click on any of those pictures, just like I'm doing right here. Got to blow them up, make them bigger for you. Replacement piston notes. You must select the correct piston rings for your engine. So if the cylinder was not resized, you're going to use standard rings. If the cylinder was resized and you're going to be using an oversized piston. In our case, I'm looking at this right here. It says 0.010. That means that this piston is 10,000ths of an inch oversized. So your cylinder would be honed or bored out 10,000ths of an inch, but you would have to make sure that you had 10,000ths of an inch rings to match the piston. If you don't, you're going to have excessive ring gaps and cause compression loss. Some manufacturers sell chrome-plated piston rings for cylinders that exceed the wear specs, and this allows the cylinder wear to exceed the specifications, but not by much. I think Briggs & Stratton, like if you go up to 5/1000ths of an inch, you can use these chrome rings. I'm still not sure how they work, but they do sell those, or they used to at least. Some oil rings have expanders that fit on behind the oil control ring to help control oil and worn cylinders. So you think of like a little spring-loaded expander that kind of forces those the oil ring out harder against the cylinder to help control oil flow. Generally, I don't really use those things. I mean, if the cylinder is worn out like that, then if it's feasible, I'd have it rebored and put a new piston, oversized piston and rings in it. Of course, like I said earlier, resized cylinders require oversized piston and rings, such as 10,000ths, 20,000ths, and 30,000ths. All gaskets are replaced when an engine is overhauled. Don't be trying to use old, worn out gaskets. Normally, you can buy a gasket kit that gives you everything you need rather than sit there and order every single gasket. Gaskets are needed to seal the very small irregularities on the part surfaces, and never reuse an old gasket. Before installing new gaskets, clean the gasket surface and mount the bolt holes around there. Make sure they're cleaned good. You can use a gasket scraper, or they sell like a Scotch-Brite pad that goes on the end of a angle grinder, and they take gaskets off real quick. Just make sure that you're not using that to like remove aluminum. Same thing with a gasket scraper. You're just trying to take the gasket material off, not scrape into the aluminum. You got to be careful when you're using those gasket scrapers. We talk about gaskets, and there's three common types of gaskets that you're going to run into. Cork up here in the top right-hand side. Those are used in low temperature areas and pressure. So there's not a lot of pressure here. There's not a lot of high temperature here. And it forms to pretty much any shape. It's very soft material. It's squishy, and it'll form into pretty much any shape. So we often find these in valve covers. That's a good place where you often find the cork. There's not a lot of hot temperature up there in the valve covers. The other one would be paper. Paper is mostly used on crankcase covers. I've never seen anything pretty much always paper on crankcase covers. Also, you'll find paper gaskets for like the backside between the carburetor and the air filter. You'll find paper gaskets there. You'll find paper gaskets on the cover that goes over the valves on an L-head engine. You'll find paper gaskets throughout the engine. And the last one is what we call the sandwich type. This is made of 2 layers of thin, soft materials such as aluminum, copper, or steel. And then it's got like a coating that they coat over top of there. And these are used to seal high pressure, high temperature areas such as the combustion chamber. So your head gaskets are typically going to be a sandwich type gasket, especially on the small engine side. Question. The type of gasket mostly used on crankcase covers is A, a sandwich type, B, paper, C, cork, or D, seal. Type of gasket mostly used on crankcase covers. Another question about gaskets. The type of gasket used in low temperature areas and pressures and forms almost into any shape. What type of gasket is that? Sandwich type, paper, cork, or seal? So this type of gasket, think of not head gasket, think of a valve cover gasket, not a lot of pressure, not high temperature. What kind of gasket would you use in there? And the last question here, This type of gasket uses 2 layers of thin, soft material that is used to seal high temperature and pressures. Is that the sandwich type, the paper, cork, or a seal? Now, seals are used to prevent leaks around areas that cannot be sealed with a gasket. So you're not going to have a seal that can seal up oil around the crankshaft, say. So we have to come up with a different plan for that. And once again, just like gaskets, oil seals are always replaced when you overhaul an engine. Any seal, put new ones in. And there's 2 main types of seals that we use. The O-ring is a solid ring used to seal areas of high pressure, such as oil pumps and cylinder heads on some motorcycles. We don't really find small engines with O-ring head to seal the heads, but in the motorcycle world we do. So seals, O-rings, they could take tremendous amount of pressures. Now the lip seal, this uses a wiper lip to prevent leakage around rotating or sliding parts, such as the end of a crankshaft. They can't handle high pressure like the O-ring seals can. So the lip seal is used in areas that don't have those high pressures. Crankshafts, not a lot of pressure inside a crankcase. So we can get away with that. You look up here at this picture, you can see this seal is leaking right around right here. Right here we have a kind of a pile of O-ring seals, and down here you can see the common lip seal right there. The type of seal that uses a solid ring to seal against or seal areas of high pressure is, so it's using a solid ring. Is that called a face seal, a lip seal, O-ring, or rubber seal? A solid ring. Next question. The type of seal that uses a wiper lip to prevent leakage around a rotating or sliding part is that a face seal, lip seal, O-ring, or rubber seal? So this time uses a wiper lip to prevent leaking. All engine parts should be lubricated during assembly. You don't want to be putting engines together dry. You've got to have time for that oil pump to start lubricating the engine. And that short little time it takes could destroy an engine without oil. Now, assembly lube is a pretty good stuff to use to lubricate bearings on assembly. It's kind of like a thick grease, but it works great for areas that like bearings and camshafts and stuff like that. And once again, it provides lubrication until the engine starts pumping oil throughout. Assembly lube can also be used to hold needle bearings in place during installation on 2-strokes. On 2-strokes, you have needle bearings that are laid in the connecting rod and the connecting rod cap. And so you use assembly lube and you kind of grease up the area, and then you lay those bearings in place so that you can reassemble it. Otherwise, it's going to be nearly impossible to hold all those needle bearings in place while you're trying to do this. Never, ever, ever use assembly lube on cylinders and rings. You're going to use motor oil for cylinders and rings. Assembly lube, bearings, camshafts, areas like that, not on the pistons and rings. Now, gasket sealer is used to improve gasket sealing or hold a gasket in place or repair a damaged gasket, which is really not a good idea. We don't really do that. You should, if a gasket's damaged, replace it. But I guess you're in a pinch, you get by with it. Or sometimes form a new gasket. If we look at motorcycles and ATVs, it's common where they don't have gaskets between the center cases. They don't only use gasket sealer. And there's different types of gasket sealers for different uses. Make sure you're using the right one. There's high temperature gasket sealer. There's different types of gasket sealer. Myself, I like 3-bound 1104 here. I think this is the best sealer for, for gaskets, for making a gasket. Works great. When using the sealer, make sure that the surfaces are clean and dry. It does not stick to oil. So make sure those sealing surfaces are wiped down really good and dry. And then put a light coat of gasket sealer on the case halves. A clean area is very important for good engine overhauling. The following should be done before you start reassembling the engine. Clean your hands. Don't be using some grubby old hands you just tore apart a dirty old engine with. Make sure your hands are clean. Clean your workbench off. The area where you're going to reassemble this engine, you want to make sure it's nice and clean. Make sure the tools are clean. I mean, you just got the tools all dirty from disassembling a dirty engine. You got to clean those things off. Otherwise, you're going to put dirt back in the engine and ruin what you just rebuilt. Make sure all the parts are clean. You don't want any dirt whatsoever to get back inside that engine. So make sure everything's good and clean. I typically take the engine apart. I have a whole nother area to reassemble. I wash the parts down, I clean them up real good, and then I put them over in that clean area. When installing the valves, the following should be followed. Install the valves in the same position in which they were removed. The bigger valve will always be the intake valve. The smaller valve would be the exhaust valve. If you just gotta make sure the valves are in the right place. Lubricate the valve stems with oil. And some valve springs have tighter coils on one end that must face toward the valve head. So if I look at this picture here, that's not really the case. I guess you might be able to say down here, but you see how this area here and here might be a little tighter wound than up here. Now, that being said, if that was the case, these would be upside down because the tighter coiled windings always face toward the valve head, which is up here in this case. So the tighter wound valve area of the valve spring always faces toward the valve head. You know, looking at this thing, it's just because of the way this is made. This really isn't tighter down here. They really don't have them upside down, but you'll distinctly see if they get tighter and tighter. Make sure they're facing toward the valve head, not toward the stem. Takes me to my next question. Some valve springs have tighter coils on one end. Which way must the spring face? A, toward the valve stem, or B, toward the valve head? When installing the piston into the connecting rod, watch for the following stuff. Assemble the piston to the connecting rod according to the instructions in the service manual. Like there might be 3 pages of ways to assemble these things, especially if you get into some of these Briggs manuals. You got to make sure that you look in the service manual and you make sure you get the piston to the rod orientation right. Looking at this picture right here, the connecting rod and piston orientation, arrow on the piston and the mag, that's magneto side, that's where the flywheel is, abbreviation to the magneto side of the engine. So you've got to make sure that this is orientated. So this rod is orientated to the piston correctly. Some piston bosses on 4-stroke engines are offset, and the offset is used to control the thrust forces on the piston skirt, and it requires the piston to be installed in the engine in the correct position. 2-stroke pistons must be installed properly or the engine will not run. You cannot be flipping around a piston on a 2-stroke. It's got arrows or dots or something that orientates it to the connecting rod properly. The connecting rods are made with oiling notches and or oil dippers that must be facing the correct direction. and these parts will only work properly in one direction and cause engine failure if installed wrong. The connecting rod must be installed correctly for proper lubrication. So if we look at this connecting rod right here, this little hole right here is an oil hole. So if you flip that rod around, that oil hole is going to be on this side of the rod. It's not going to get the oil it needs to lubricate this bearing down here. Also, this dipper right here, with this arrow pointing to the dipper, that dipper has to go in the right direction. Now this kind of looks like a Honda rod to me. If this were to be put on backwards, the engine would lock up when you started turning it around. But sometimes the dippers are on the bottom. You gotta make sure that these things are installed properly, or else you're gonna cause engine damage, or you're gonna cause the engine to lock up. My next question, the connecting rod assembly must be orientated properly to the A, cylinder block, B, piston, C, instructions in the service manual, or D, crankcase cover. And that is end of day one lesson. Now tomorrow we'll get into the next lesson. We'll get into expanding and just continue on some of these important things that we need to know about as we reassemble these engines. And all of this information can be used on your motorcycle, your ATV, your small engine, and even the car engines. So it's pretty important stuff. If you're in the motors, it's pretty important stuff. Thanks for coming. Thanks for stopping in and watching this video. And I'll be seeing you for day 2.